80 years ago, during the final liberation of Dachau concentration camp in April 1945, Army Medic Sergeant Michael Thompson vanished without leaving any trace. His absence plunged the family into tragedy and silent mourning, while the community and fellow soldiers remained confused by the mystery. Military archives suggested hypotheses, but no conclusion was reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but the family never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. April 29, 1945. The 42nd Infantry Division was advancing toward Dachau concentration camp, and liberation was imminent. Sergeant Michael Thompson, a 24-year-old medic from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had served faithfully for 3 years across the European theater. His medical bag had saved countless lives from Normandy to Bavaria, and his fellow soldiers knew him as a man of unwavering moral conviction. Thompson's last confirmed sighting was at 0400 hours on April 29th, when he reported to his commanding officer about treating wounded prisoners who had been discovered in a transport train near the camp's perimeter. Witnesses described him as visibly shaken by what he had seen, but determined to continue his medical duties. His unit was scheduled to enter the camp at dawn, alongside other liberating forces. By 0800 hours, when the gates of Dachau were breached and American forces flooded into the compound, Sergeant Thompson was nowhere to be found. His medical supplies remained in the unit's staging area, untouched. His rifle was discovered leaning against a tree approximately 200 yards from the camp's main entrance, but there were no signs of struggle or combat. The immediate assumption was that Thompson had been captured or killed by retreating SS guards, but no body was recovered despite extensive searches. Fellow medics reported that he had expressed deep concern about the condition of prisoners they had encountered, speaking repeatedly about moral obligations that transcended military orders. Private First Class James Rodriguez, Thompson's closest friend in the unit, later testified that the sergeant had seemed haunted by something he couldn't shake during those final hours. Military investigators questioned dozens of witnesses and examined every possible scenario. Some suggested Thompson had been executed by SS officers attempting to cover evidence of atrocities. Others theorized he might have pursued fleeing guards into the surrounding forests and been killed in an unreported skirmish. A few whispered that he had suffered a psychological breakdown upon witnessing the camp's horrors and had simply wandered away in shock. The official investigation concluded after 6 weeks, with Thompson declared missing in action, presumed dead. His family in Cedar Rapids received a standard military notification and a Purple Heart awarded posthumously. His mother, Margaret Thompson, refused to accept that her son was gone, writing letters to military officials and congressmen for decades, demanding answers that never came. The war ended, soldiers returned home, and Michael Thompson became another name on a memorial wall. But in the quiet farmhouse in Iowa, his absence echoed through generations. His younger brother, Robert, spent his entire adult life researching military archives, convinced that somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of war records lay the truth about Michael's final hours. What none of them could have imagined was that the answers they desperately sought were hidden just yards from where Michael was last seen, sealed within the walls of Dachau itself, waiting 8 decades to emerge from darkness into light. March 15, 2023. Renovation crews working on the Dachau memorial site made an extraordinary discovery that would finally illuminate one of the war's forgotten mysteries. Hidden within a false wall in the former SS barracks, workers uncovered a deteriorating leather journal wrapped in oilcloth, along with personal effects that belonged to an American soldier. The journal bore the name M. Thompson embossed on its cover, and the first entry was dated April 28, 1945, just 1 day before the liberation. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, head archivist at the memorial site, immediately recognized the significance of the find and contacted American military historians. What they discovered within those pages would challenge everything the Thompson family believed about Michael's disappearance. The journal's early entries revealed a medic struggling with the unprecedented horrors he was witnessing as Allied forces approached the concentration camp system. Thompson wrote extensively about treating prisoners who had escaped from transport trains, describing conditions that seemed beyond human endurance. His medical training had prepared him for battlefield wounds, but nothing had prepared him for systematic starvation, disease, and brutality on an industrial scale. April 28, 1945. Treated 17 prisoners today from the cattle cars. I keep thinking about the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. Oh, but how do you heal people who have been so deliberately broken? How do you restore humanity to those who have been systematically stripped of it? I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. The entries grew increasingly disturbed as Thompson documented what he was witnessing. He wrote about prisoners who begged him not to return them to the camp, knowing liberation was imminent, but fearing what might happen in those final hours. He described conversations with dying prisoners who spoke of mass executions being planned as Allied forces approached, desperate attempts by guards to eliminate evidence of their crimes. More troubling were Thompson's growing suspicions about collaboration between some Allied personnel and camp administrators. Several journal entries referenced meetings he had observed between American officers and SS officials, conversations conducted in hushed tones away from regular troops. Thompson began to suspect that some form of negotiated surrender was being arranged that would allow certain war criminals to escape justice. April 29th, 0200 hours. Overheard Lieutenant Colonel speaking with SS officer near the administrative building. Couldn't make out all the words but heard safe passage and certain arrangements. Something isn't right. These men should be arrested, not negotiated with. The prisoners I treated yesterday spoke of plans to eliminate witnesses before we arrive. How can we stand by and let this happen? The final entries in the journal became increasingly frantic and disjointed. Thompson wrote about his growing conviction that he needed to act to prevent additional atrocities, even if it meant disobeying orders. He documented his plans to enter the camp ahead of the official liberation, hoping to prevent last-minute executions and gather evidence of war crimes. April 29th, 0330 hours. I can't wait for official authorization. People are dying while we follow protocol. I've seen enough death to know when more is coming. If I can save even a few lives by acting now, it's worth the risk. God forgive me if I'm wrong, but I can't live with myself if I do nothing. The journal ended abruptly with that entry, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. What had Thompson discovered that compelled him to act alone? Had he uncovered evidence of collaboration between Allied and Axis forces? Most importantly, what had happened to him after he made that final, fateful decision? Dr. Hoffman's team immediately began cross-referencing Thompson's journal entries with historical records from the liberation of Dachau. What they found would reveal a complex web of wartime politics, moral compromise, and individual courage that had remained buried for nearly 8 decades. The journal entries painted a picture of a man driven to desperate action by what he perceived as a moral crisis. Thompson's final night alive was spent documenting evidence and preparing for what he clearly understood might be a suicide mission. His medical training had taught him to preserve life, but his conscience was demanding something that military protocol forbade. According to his journal, Thompson had discovered that certain high-ranking SS officers were being offered safe passage in exchange for cooperation during the camp's transfer to Allied control. He wrote extensively about conversations he had overheard between American intelligence officers and German administrators, negotiations that seemed to prioritize political objectives over justice for the camp's victims. April 29th, 0400 hours. The bargains being made in the shadows are unconscionable. How many war criminals will escape justice for the sake of strategic intelligence? How many victims will be forgotten in the name of expediency? I became a medic to save lives, not to enable those who destroy them. Thompson's plan, as revealed in his journal, was to enter Dachau before the official liberation and gather photographic evidence of both the atrocities and the ongoing negotiations. He had obtained a camera from a deceased war correspondent and planned to document everything he could find. His hope was to create an undeniable record that would prevent any cover-ups or political whitewashing of the camp's horrors. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested to know what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The medic's movements during his final hours can be partially reconstructed from witness testimonies and physical evidence found with the journal. At approximately 0430 hours, Thompson was seen near the camp's perimeter fence, carrying his medical bag and what witnesses described as additional equipment. He told a guard that he was responding to reports of wounded prisoners near the main gate. Security footage from Allied checkpoints declassified decades later shows Thompson passing through authorized zones at 0445 hours. He was alone and appeared to be moving with purpose toward the camp's administrative section. This was the last official record of his whereabouts, as subsequent entries in guard logs were destroyed in what was later described as routine document disposal. Thompson's journal described his discovery of a hidden entrance to the camp, likely used by SS officers for clandestine meetings. He wrote about following this passage into the administrative quarters, where he hoped to find documentary evidence of war crimes and any records of negotiated immunity deals. His plan was to photograph everything he could and return to Allied lines before the official liberation began. 0500 hours. Found the entrance. The smell is indescribable. Death and fear and something else I can't name. I can hear voices ahead speaking in both German and English. This is what I was afraid of. They're still making deals while people die. I have to document this. The journal's final coherent entry suggested that Thompson had successfully infiltrated the administrative building and was in the process of photographing documents when he was discovered. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, suggesting he was writing while hiding or under extreme stress. They found me, heard footsteps, American voices shouting orders, not to help me, to stop me. God help us all. The photographs are hidden. Someone needs to find them. The truth needs to survive even if I don't. After this entry, the journal contained only scattered words and phrases, written in what appeared to be Thompson's blood. The final legible words were Barracks 7 and truth buried with the dead. These cryptic references would prove crucial to understanding both Thompson's fate and the broader conspiracy he had discovered. The physical evidence found with the journal included fragments of camera equipment and several rolls of undeveloped film, carefully preserved in waterproof containers. When finally processed in 2023, these photographs would reveal the shocking truth about what Thompson had witnessed in his final hours. When the film found with Thompson's journal was finally developed using modern techniques, the images revealed a story that military historians had never imagined. The photographs showed not only the horrific conditions within Dachau hours before liberation, but also documented meetings between American intelligence officers and high-ranking SS officials that suggested a coordinated effort to manage the camp's surrender in ways that would protect certain war criminals. The first roll of film contained images that were consistent with other liberation documentation: emaciated prisoners, overcrowded barracks, evidence of systematic murder. But Thompson's photographs were taken from unique vantage points that suggested he had access to areas that were later sealed or destroyed before official documentation could occur. These images provided evidence of atrocities that had been deliberately hidden from the liberating forces. More disturbing were photographs from the second roll of film, which showed American officers in conference with German administrators in what appeared to be the camp's main administrative building. The images were taken through windows and from concealed positions, suggesting Thompson had been conducting covert surveillance of these meetings. Documents visible in some photographs appeared to be identity papers and safe passage authorizations. Dr. Michael Patterson, a military historian specializing in World War II intelligence operations, analyzed the photographs and cross-referenced them with declassified documents from American and German archives. His research revealed a complex web of post-war planning that involved allowing certain Nazi officials to escape prosecution in exchange for intelligence about Soviet operations and scientific research. What Thompson documented was essentially a shadow negotiation that was taking place parallel to the official liberation, Dr. Patterson explained in his 2024 report. American intelligence services were already thinking about the post-war world and the coming confrontation with the Soviet Union. Some German officials were being offered immunity in exchange for cooperation against the new enemy. The photographs showed at least 3 American officers in direct negotiation with SS personnel who should have been immediately arrested as war criminals. Identity analysis of the German officials revealed men who would later disappear entirely from the historical record, suggesting they had indeed been given safe passage in exchange for their cooperation. These revelations challenged the accepted narrative of American moral authority during the liberation of the concentration camps. Thompson's final photographs, taken apparently just before his disappearance, showed him attempting to document specific papers and identity cards that were being processed for the escaping officials. One image clearly showed stacks of false identity documents and what appeared to be American military transport authorizations. Another showed a map with marked escape routes through Allied-controlled territory. The most chilling photograph was the last one on the roll, a blurry image that appeared to show Thompson's reflection in a window as he was discovered taking the pictures. Behind his reflection, several figures could be seen approaching, including at least one person in American military uniform. This image suggested that Thompson had been caught in the act by the very people whose activities he was trying to expose. Analysis of the photograph angles and shadows indicated that Thompson had spent several hours inside the administrative building, carefully documenting evidence from multiple rooms and vantage points. His systematic approach suggested medical training applied to intelligence gathering, methodical, thorough, and focused on preserving evidence that could save lives by ensuring justice was served. The quality and composition of the photographs also revealed that Thompson had considerable skill with the camera equipment, suggesting he had planned this operation carefully and had possibly practiced with the equipment beforehand. This contradicted military reports that portrayed his disappearance as an impulsive decision by a traumatized soldier. When these photographs were presented to the Thompson family in 2024, they provided answers to questions that had haunted 3 generations, but they also raised new questions about the price Michael had paid for his moral courage and whether anyone else had known about his investigation into Allied complicity with war criminals. For 78 years, the Thompson family had lived with an absence that shaped every holiday, every milestone, and every quiet moment of reflection. Michael's disappearance had created a wound that never healed, passed down through generations like a genetic inheritance of grief and unresolved questions. Margaret Thompson, Michael's mother, had died in 1987 at age 89, never knowing what happened to her eldest son. She had spent 4 decades writing letters to military officials, congressmen, and veterans organizations, demanding answers that never came. Her dining room table had been permanently covered with copies of military correspondence, newspaper clippings, and maps of Germany marked with possible locations where Michael might be buried. Robert Thompson, Michael's younger brother, inherited both his mother's determination and her collection of unanswered questions. As a young man, he had planned to become a farmer like his father, but Michael's disappearance had driven him toward military history and genealogical research. He spent his adult life traveling to Germany, interviewing veterans, and searching through archives for any trace of his brother's fate. "I never knew my brother as an adult," Robert told historians in 2023 at age 96. He was 19 when he enlisted, just a kid who wanted to help people. But his ghost has been part of our family longer than he was ever alive. Every family gathering had an empty chair. Every Christmas had unopened presents we kept buying him, year after year, just in case. The discovery of Michael's journal and photographs brought the Thompson family a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. Robert's daughter, Susan Thompson Martinez, had continued her grandfather and father's research into the 21st century, using internet resources and digital archives to search for clues. When she received the call from Dr. Hoffman about the journal discovery, it represented both the answer to her family's prayers and the beginning of a new chapter in their grief. Learning that Uncle Michael died trying to expose war criminals, that he sacrificed himself for moral principles, that gives his death meaning, Susan explained. But discovering that he was probably killed by American officers, that our own military may have covered up his murder to protect war criminals, that's almost too much to bear. The photographs revealed that Michael had been aware he was in mortal danger during his final hours. Several images showed him writing what appeared to be letters or final messages, though these documents were never found. The careful way he had hidden the film and journal suggested he hoped someone would eventually discover the truth, even if he didn't survive to tell it himself. Robert Thompson's reaction to seeing the photographs of his brother's final hours was complex. At nearly 97 years old, he had expected to die without ever knowing Michael's fate. The revelation that his brother had been a hero who died fighting injustice provided closure, but also raised questions about whether the family should pursue further investigation into American military complicity. "Part of me wants to let sleeping dogs lie," Robert admitted. "Michael's been dead for 80 years. The people who killed him are probably dead too." But another part of me thinks that if he was brave enough to die for the truth, maybe we owe it to him to make sure that truth doesn't get buried again. The family's decision to allow public release of Michael's journal and photographs was not unanimous. Some relatives felt that exposing potential American war crimes would dishonor Michael's military service and the memory of other veterans who had served honorably. Others argued that Michael himself would have wanted the truth revealed, regardless of its political implications. Susan Thompson Martinez ultimately became the family spokesperson, working with historians and journalists to ensure that Michael's story was told accurately and respectfully. She insisted that any public presentation of the evidence should focus on her uncle's moral courage rather than on political conspiracy theories or anti-American sentiment. Uncle Michael died because he believed that doing the right thing was more important than following orders, she said. He believed that American values were worth fighting for, even when some Americans weren't living up to those values. His story isn't about condemning America, it's about holding America accountable to its own ideals. The family's burden had evolved from not knowing what happened to Michael to knowing too much about the circumstances of his death and the broader moral compromises that had contributed to it. Declassified documents from the 1990s and 2000s, combined with Thompson's photographic evidence, painted a disturbing picture of institutional knowledge and deliberate suppression of information about his disappearance. Military investigators in 1945 had not simply failed to solve the case. They had actively prevented its resolution to protect a broader intelligence operation that involved collaboration with former Nazi officials. The official investigation file, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests by the Thompson family's attorney, contained numerous redacted sections and missing pages that suggested systematic removal of evidence. More tellingly, the file included references to photographs and witness statements that were never made available to the Thompson family or included in official reports. Lieutenant Colonel William Brennan, who had commanded the intelligence unit operating at Dachau during liberation, left behind personal papers that were donated to the National Archives after his death in 1987. These papers, which remained classified until 2019, included private correspondence that directly referenced Thompson's disappearance and described it as an unfortunate but necessary security measure to protect vital post-war intelligence assets. If this case has already caught your attention, leave a like. This helps Michael Thompson's story reach more people. In a letter dated May 15, 1945, Brennan wrote to a superior officer, "The medic's photographs could have compromised Operation Paperclip before it even began. His misguided moral objections to our German contacts would have resulted in the loss of invaluable intelligence assets to the Soviets. While regrettable, his removal was essential to national security interests that transcend individual sensitivities about wartime justice." Operation Paperclip, declassified in the 1970s, was the secret American program to recruit Nazi scientists and intelligence officers for use against the Soviet Union. What Thompson had apparently discovered was an early phase of this operation, involving the protection and extraction of SS officers who possessed valuable intelligence about Soviet operations and German scientific research. Brennan's correspondence revealed that Thompson had been under surveillance for several days before his disappearance, after he was observed taking unauthorized photographs and asking questions about post-war planning. American counterintelligence officers had determined that he posed a security risk and needed to be neutralized before he could compromise ongoing operations. The method of Thompson's elimination was described in coded language in military communications, but witness statements from German prisoners suggested he had been confronted by American officers while attempting to document evidence in the administrative building. When he refused to surrender his photographs and notes, he was apparently shot and his body disposed of in one of the camp's crematoriums, which was still operational during the transition period. This revelation was particularly disturbing because it meant Thompson's remains had been destroyed, using the same facilities that the Nazis had used to eliminate evidence of their own crimes. The symbolic horror of an American soldier being murdered and cremated in a Nazi death camp to protect war criminals represented a moral nadir that challenged fundamental assumptions about American conduct during World War II. Military records showed that several other personnel had raised questions about Thompson's disappearance, but these individuals were quickly reassigned to different units or discharged from service. Private First Class James Rodriguez, Thompson's closest friend, was transferred to the Pacific Theater within weeks of asking about the missing medic. His subsequent letters home, intercepted by military censors, showed increasing paranoia and fear about what he might have witnessed. The cover-up extended beyond military channels into civilian government agencies. Congressional inquiries from Thompson's home state representatives were deflected with standard responses about ongoing investigations and classified military operations. Letters from the Thompson family were answered with form responses that provided no substantive information while implying that further questions would be unpatriotic during wartime. Perhaps most cynically, military officials awarded Thompson a posthumous Purple Heart and Bronze Star, honors that were presented to his family with great ceremony, while the same officials knew exactly how and why he had died. The citations for these medals praised Thompson's dedication to medical service and sacrifice in the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, language that was technically true, but deliberately obscured the circumstances of his death. The systematic nature of the cover-up suggested institutional approval at high levels of military command. This was not the action of a few rogue officers, but a coordinated effort to protect intelligence operations that prioritized strategic advantage over justice and accountability. Thompson's death was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of moral compromise that characterized American intelligence operations in the final months of World War II and the early Cold War period. His journal and photographs provided evidence of systematic collaboration with Nazi officials that extended far beyond the famous cases of scientists recruited through Operation Paperclip. Dr. Patterson's research, supported by newly declassified documents from multiple government agencies, revealed that American intelligence services had begun negotiating with SS officials as early as March 1945, weeks before the liberation of Dachau. These negotiations involved not just the recruitment of individuals with valuable scientific or intelligence information, but the protection of entire networks of Nazi officials who could provide ongoing intelligence about Soviet activities. The photographs Thompson had taken showed at least 12 different German officials receiving American protection documents, many of whom had been directly involved in the operation of Dachau and other concentration camps. Post-war records showed that several of these men later played significant roles in early CIA operations against the Soviet Union, their war crimes overlooked in favor of their anti-communist credentials. Thompson's journal included names and physical descriptions of American officers involved in these negotiations, information that allowed researchers to trace their subsequent careers and activities. Several of these officers went on to prominent positions in the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where they continued to work with former Nazi officials throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The moral implications of these discoveries extended beyond Thompson's individual case to fundamental questions about American values and the price of strategic advantage. Documents revealed that American officials were aware they were protecting men who had committed atrocities against American prisoners of war, Jewish refugees, and civilian populations. The decision to prioritize intelligence value over justice was made consciously and at the highest levels of government. Thompson's photographs provided visual evidence of the human cost of these decisions. Images taken in the hours before liberation showed prisoners who were being systematically eliminated to prevent them from testifying about war crimes. American officials were aware of these ongoing murders, but delayed intervention to allow their German contacts time to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. The medic's moral objection to these activities was shared by other American personnel who witnessed the negotiations. Military records contained reports from chaplains, medical officers, and enlisted men who expressed concern about American collaboration with Nazi officials. These reports were systematically suppressed, and the individuals who filed them were often reassigned or discharged to prevent further questions. Thompson's case was unique only in that he had attempted to document and preserve evidence of these activities. His medical background had given him access to areas of the camp that other personnel could not enter, and his moral convictions had driven him to act when others remained silent. But his death was part of a broader pattern of eliminating potential witnesses to American moral compromise. The scope of the conspiracy extended beyond military and intelligence agencies, to include diplomatic and political officials who were aware of and approved these activities. Congressional hearings from the 1970s revealed that senior State Department officials had been informed about Operation Paperclip and related programs, but had chosen to prioritize strategic considerations over legal and moral objections. Documents from the Nuremberg trials showed that American prosecutors were aware that some war criminals were being protected by American intelligence services, but were prevented from pursuing these cases by orders from Washington. Justice Robert Jackson, chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, wrote privately about his frustration with political interference that protected men who should have been tried for crimes against humanity. Thompson's journal included speculation about the long-term consequences of these moral compromises, observations that proved remarkably prescient given later revelations about American support for authoritarian regimes during the Cold War. He wrote about his fear that protecting Nazi war criminals would establish a precedent for overlooking atrocities committed by American allies, a pattern that would indeed characterize American foreign policy for decades. The broader conspiracy that cost Thompson his life represented a fundamental shift in American moral philosophy, from idealistic principles to pragmatic realpolitik. His death marked not just the loss of an individual life, but the symbolic death of American innocence about its own capacity for moral compromise in pursuit of strategic advantage. The revelation of Thompson's true fate and the circumstances surrounding his death sent shockwaves through multiple communities: military historians, Holocaust researchers, intelligence scholars, and the broader American public grappling with uncomfortable truths about their nation's past. The implications extended far beyond a single case of military cover-up to fundamental questions about accountability, justice, and the moral costs of strategic expedience. Within the military history community, Thompson's case became a catalyst for broader examination of American conduct during the liberation of Nazi concentration camps. Researchers began investigating other unexplained disappearances and deaths of American personnel who had raised questions about post-war intelligence operations. Several similar cases emerged, suggesting a pattern of eliminating witnesses to American collaboration with Nazi officials. The Holocaust Memorial Museum incorporated Thompson's story into its permanent exhibition on liberation, but only after extensive debate about how to present evidence of American moral compromise without undermining the broader narrative of American moral leadership in defeating fascism. The museum's decision to include the story was influenced by Thompson family members who argued that Holocaust remembrance required confronting difficult truths about liberation as well as celebrating heroic actions. For intelligence historians, Thompson's photographs provided unprecedented visual evidence of early CIA recruitment of Nazi officials. Dr. Annie Jacobson, author of Operation Paperclip, described Thompson's documentation as the smoking gun that proves American intelligence services were protecting war criminals not just for scientific knowledge, but for ongoing intelligence operations that required their networks to remain intact. The legal implications of Thompson's case proved more complex. While his murder was clearly documented, the perpetrators were long dead and the statute of limitations had expired decades earlier. However, his evidence provided support for ongoing litigation by Holocaust survivors seeking compensation from corporations and governments that had collaborated with Nazi officials, protected by American intelligence services. Congressional representatives from Thompson's home state of Iowa introduced legislation requiring declassification of all remaining documents related to American recruitment of Nazi officials. The Thompson Truth Act, as it became known, faced opposition from intelligence agencies, arguing that disclosure would compromise ongoing operations and reveal intelligence methods that remained sensitive even decades later. The international implications were equally significant. European governments that had been excluded from American negotiations with Nazi officials expressed outrage at revelations that war criminals had been protected, while their own citizens continued to seek justice for wartime atrocities. The German government, in particular, faced renewed pressure to investigate how American protection had allowed Nazi officials to escape prosecution for crimes committed on German soil. Thompson's journal entries about the long-term consequences of moral compromise proved remarkably prescient. when compared to later American foreign policy decisions. His prediction that protecting Nazi war criminals would establish precedents for overlooking atrocities committed by Cold War allies was borne out by American support for authoritarian regimes in Latin America, Asia, and Africa throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The psychological impact on Thompson family members was profound and complex. Learning the truth about Michael's death provided closure to questions that had haunted 3 generations, but also created new forms of grief and anger about the systematic deception they had endured. Susan Thompson Martinez became a vocal advocate for government transparency and accountability, speaking at universities and conferences about the human cost of institutional secrecy. Religious communities grappled with the theological implications of Thompson's story, a man who died for moral principles, but whose death was covered up by the very nation he had served faithfully. His case became a focal point for discussions about Christian obligation to resist evil, even when resistance came at personal cost, and about institutional complicity in moral compromise. The broader public reaction was complicated by political polarization and competing narratives about American exceptionalism. Some viewed Thompson as a martyr to American ideals, who died defending values that the nation had temporarily abandoned in pursuit of strategic advantage. Others saw his story as unpatriotic criticism of American military and intelligence services that had made difficult but necessary decisions to protect national security. Educational institutions incorporated Thompson's case into curricula about ethics, military history, and Holocaust studies. His journal entries became required reading in courses about moral decision-making under extreme circumstances, and his photographs were used to illustrate the complex moral landscape of post-war Europe, where the lines between liberation and occupation, justice and expedience became blurred. The long-term impact of Thompson's story extended beyond historical education to contemporary debates about accountability and transparency in government operations. His case became a touchstone for arguments about the public's right to know about government activities, even when those activities were undertaken for ostensibly patriotic purposes. 8 decades after Sergeant Michael Thompson disappeared into the moral darkness of Dachau's final hours, his story had finally emerged from the shadows to illuminate uncomfortable truths about American conduct during one of history's most defining moments. The journal and photographs hidden in the concentration camp's walls served as a time capsule of conscience, preserving one man's moral courage against institutional compromise. The Thompson family's long journey toward truth reached its conclusion in a ceremony at the Dachau Memorial Site on April 29, 2025, exactly 80 years after Michael's disappearance. Susan Thompson Martinez, now 78 years old and representing 4 generations of unanswered questions, placed a memorial plaque near the site where her uncle's journal was discovered. The ceremony was attended by German officials, American diplomats, Holocaust survivors, and military historians who had spent years piecing together the full story. Uncle Michael died because he believed that American values were worth dying for, even when some Americans weren't living up to those values, Susan said during the ceremony. His story isn't about condemning America, it's about holding America accountable to its own ideals. That's what he died trying to do, and that's what we're still trying to do today. The memorial plaque bore a simple inscription, in memory of Sergeant Michael Thompson, U.S. Army Medical Corps, who disappeared April 29, 1945, while documenting evidence of war crimes. His moral courage preserved the truth when others chose silence. Some things are worth dying for. Dr. Hoffman, who had supervised the journal's discovery and authentication, reflected on the broader significance of Thompson's story during the memorial ceremony. This case reminds us that historical truth is often buried not just by time, but by deliberate institutional decisions to suppress uncomfortable realities. Michael Thompson's journal survived because he believed someone would eventually care enough to seek the truth, even if he didn't live to see it vindicated. The German government's response to Thompson's story was complex, but ultimately supportive of full disclosure. German officials acknowledged that American protection of Nazi war criminals had complicated their own efforts at denazification and justice for Holocaust victims. The German Foreign Ministry issued a statement expressing regret that American intelligence operations had protected men who should have faced German courts for their crimes. American government response remained more circumspect. The Pentagon acknowledged Thompson's service and sacrifice, while maintaining that historical context was necessary to understand wartime intelligence decisions. The CIA declined to comment on specific operational details, but issued a general statement acknowledging that early Cold War operations had sometimes prioritized strategic objectives over other considerations. The academic and historical communities embraced Thompson's story as a crucial addition to understanding the moral complexity of World War II's aftermath. His case was incorporated into major historical works about the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, Operation Paperclip, and the origins of the Cold War. His photographs became part of permanent archives at the National Holocaust Museum, the National Archives, and the Imperial War Museum in London. For Holocaust education, Thompson's story provided a powerful example of individual moral courage, while also illustrating the institutional failures that allowed war criminals to escape justice. His case became part of curricula designed to teach students about the importance of individual moral responsibility, even within larger systems of authority and obedience. The legal legacy of Thompson's case extended beyond his individual story to broader questions about government accountability and the public's right to know about historical injustices. The Thompson Truth Act, while still pending in Congress, had already prompted declassification of thousands of documents related to American recruitment of Nazi officials and other controversial intelligence operations. Thompson's journal entries about the long-term consequences of moral compromise continued to resonate in contemporary political debates. His warnings about the precedent set by protecting war criminals proved prophetic given later American support for authoritarian allies during the Cold War, and his insights about institutional complicity remained relevant to ongoing discussions about accountability and transparency. The personal impact on the Thompson family was profound, but ultimately healing. Robert Thompson, who had died in 2024 at age 97, had lived long enough to learn the truth about his brother's fate and to see Michael's moral courage recognized and honored. His daughter Susan continued advocating for government transparency, speaking at universities and conferences about the importance of preserving historical truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. The story of Michael Thompson's disappearance and the decades-long journey to uncover the truth served as a reminder that history's most important lessons often emerge from its darkest chapters. His case illustrated both the capacity for individual moral heroism and the institutional tendency to suppress inconvenient truths in service of broader political objectives. In the end, Thompson's journal had achieved what he hoped it would, preserving evidence that someone would eventually discover and use to hold powerful institutions accountable for their actions. His story became a testament to the power of individual conscience against institutional pressure, and to the importance of preserving truth, even when that truth challenges comfortable narratives about national honor and moral authority. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows of Dachau, carried forward by a family's persistence and a medic's moral courage that had transcended death itself. Michael Thompson's voice, silent for 80 years, had finally found its way home. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Michael Thompson's story. We'll see you in the next video.